We are Life Church Livonia.
All right, friends. I have a feeling that if I let you, you would just do this the rest of the service, and I love that about our church. So once again, welcome to Life Church Livonia. If we've never had a chance to meet, my name is Brian. I'm the pastor here, and I would love to have a chance to meet you after the service, so let's have an opportunity to do that. And I'm just really glad that you chose to come and join us today. Whether you're here because you have a family member or a friend that dedicated a baby today, or you're here just because you're kind of exploring what it means to be a part of a church and who God is, I think that there's something for each of you here in this place. And what I try to remind people on a regular basis is that not every single message that we preach applies really directly to you in the moment, but all of them apply at some point in your life or apply deeply in the lives of people that you know. And so I pray that you find your spot in this story. And what we want to do here at Life Church Livonia is really connect the scriptures, God's word, the Bible, to your everyday life. To help you to understand that this isn't just a holy book that is remote and distant and inapplicable to your life, but it actually impacts our everyday living. And so that's why we've been in this series over the last few weeks, When God Doesn't Make Sense. Because for all of us, at some point in our life, we've had a moment where we look out at the world, we look at our experiences, we look at something that's going on around us, and we just think to ourselves, what is happening? Like, God, if you're real, then what is going on? And so what we've been doing for the last few weeks is just asking that question and being bold about it and saying, what is it that we should do when God doesn't make sense? And the first thing that I have found helpful, that I just want to just start at this point where we can all just understand that it's really helpful to realize that your experience is common. Many of us, we walk in the door, maybe we're not accustomed to coming to church, or maybe we've come to church for a long time, and we put ourselves in this kind of isolation booth where we believe that we are the only one who struggles with this question. We kid ourselves by thinking that we're the only one who has doubts. We're the only one that wonders, God, if you're real, then why is it that you're so hard to understand? Why is it that I have such a hard time understanding you and what you do in this world and in this life of mine? But the reality of it is that struggling with these kind of questions is a normal and natural part of being human. It doesn't make you a bad Christian. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a normal person. It makes you the kind of person that we want here, real people asking real questions about a real God so that we can live into a real life. And so the first thing we have to do is realize that our experience is common. And the second thing we have to do is to know that we don't have to understand God to believe in God. I'm actually really glad about that. Because if I could boil God down to a single sentence, like an easily understandable construct, then God would cease to be God. There is so much to who God is and what God's plan is about that I don't understand. I'm a pastor. I study God for a living. But there are still parts of God that I don't get. I'm glad because God is God and I am not. The one who spoke the very world into existence. The one who knows every thought in every head in this entire room and all the world at the same time is beyond my comprehension. And we do not have to fully understand God in order to believe in God. There are aspects of God that we can come to understand and things about the nature of God that we should know and that God wants us to know. But there's other parts of God that will never become fully clear to us this side of heaven and probably not even there because God is God and we are not. So we don't have to understand God fully in order to believe in God. Because this is also true, that common struggles lead to normal questions, but don't have to be a barrier to faith. So your common struggles, your common experiences in life lead to normal questions, but don't have to be the barrier between you and faith in God. Most of us ask the question that I think you will resonate with, and it's this. We look out at the world and we say, Why doesn't God do something about that? Whatever your that is. You look at the war or hunger or disease, and you're like, if you really are loving God, if you're actually real God, then why don't you do something about that? And for most of us, if I ask you to fill in the blank, what is your that? You could come up with something pretty easily. In fact, your that might be sitting next to you this morning. Please don't elbow them. That is not a healthy thing. And you're also not allowed on the way home to ask your spouse or your best friend or whoever you came with, am I your that? That will not end well for you. This is between you and God, but sometimes that's the truth, is that the question we're asking God, why don't you do something about that, is a relationship that we're in. It's a person that we struggle with. It's some reality in our life that is super personal to us. And we ask that question, and it's a normal question. And when God doesn't appear to be doing anything about that, it leads us to believe things about God that aren't true at all. It leads some of us to a place where we begin to believe that God is a lie, a myth, a fable told by people to make themselves feel better. And we don't feel better at all because God's appearing to ignore our that. Or maybe some of us, we come to a place where we believe, well, okay, God is real, but God clearly must not be loving. Like if God actually loved me or loved them, he would do something about that. Or we come to another place where we're like, okay, God, maybe you're real, but maybe you're just bad at this. Like you need an assistant. We come to this funky, weird place in our relationship with God where our questions lead to doubts, and our doubts mess up our theology of who God is. And so what we've done in this series throughout the last few weeks, especially for those of you who maybe this is your first time, is we've looked at multiple people in the New Testament that God clearly loved, that Jesus clearly had a relationship with, and who struggled with normal questions. We've looked at the Apostle Paul, whom Jesus met on the road to Damascus personally and empowered to do ministry that has changed the entire world. That Jesus clearly knew Paul, clearly loved Paul, and yet Paul had some type of affliction in his life, some kind of struggle that he prayed over and over again that God would remove, and God never removed it. It appeared in that situation, it appeared that God was uncooperative. We know that John the Baptist, who was related to Jesus, who ushered in Jesus' ministry, who made straight the paths for the Lord, he languished in prison while Jesus walked around and did ministry, and Jesus didn't go to him. You should wonder why that happened. Why is it that Jesus let him die in prison when he was walking around and he could have spoken a word and the chains would have fallen off? It appeared as if God was inattentive. And today what we do is we have an opportunity to ask the question, what do we do when God seems late? Not just inattentive, not just uncooperative, but it just seems like God's timing is off. Like, you're late, God. And we look at another story of another family. And every time we dig into one of these stories, every time we see a situation where it appears as if God didn't make sense, we learn from those situations, like, how do we respond, God, when that happens to me? Because every single time that it seemed like God was uncooperative, he wasn't actually. There was a purpose, there was a reason. When it seemed as if God was inattentive, same thing. His heart, his mind was on John the Baptist. And even when God seems late, God is always at work. And so today, we look at not just one person, but we look at three people. They were siblings. Their names were Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And they have a situation that we dig into today where it really seems like Jesus had screwed up. And when you read the story, it actually becomes a little confusing. So we're just going to, instead of teaching a little bit of a verse and then going into my story and telling you maybe a funny story about someone else, we're just going to dig into God's word. And we're going to read the entire story and pull out the pieces that I think will help you and will help me to know what we should do when God seems late. So we're going to jump into John chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And this Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who had poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. So let me just give you a little bit of background information about this. Jesus knew them. He knew them well. He'd been in their home. In fact, as this text tells us, Mary had been a person that had come to the feet of Jesus in this really awkward moment in her home, and she had actually worshiped him. And she'd poured perfume at his feet. People have been like, what are you doing? Like, this is weird. This is kind of awkward. And Jesus is like, no, what she's doing is actually really good because she has an understanding of who I am already that you guys don't have. They knew Jesus. He'd eaten with them. He'd probably spent the night at their home. The disciples had hung out with them, and they'd learned together from Jesus. So their brother gets sick, and what is the first thing they do? Call Jesus. Like, seriously, call, like, you have his number, call him. I'm going to text him. I'm going to ring him up. And because this is real people, real God, real life, I have real allergies. I apologize in advance. At least 3 times during this message. It just is what it is. I want to know why God doesn't do something about that. Right? Like, what's the deal with allergies, Lord? And what's the deal with... The other thing I would want to ask him when I get to heaven is like, God, what's up with mosquitoes? Has anyone else wondered this? Okay, I digress. Here we go. Back to the story. So, their brother's sick. First thing that comes to mind, call Jesus. We know him. We've seen him do things. We know he has power. We have an idea. We're starting to get this idea of who he is. Call Jesus. He can do something about it. So they send this message, and the message they send is simply this: Lord, the one you love is sick. This is important. They didn't even have to say his name. They didn't have to say, Lord, Lazarus is sick. They simply said, Lord, the one you love is sick. What does that tell you about the relationship between Jesus and Lazarus? It meant that they were really tight. Because if you got that text today, if your phone rang right this moment in this really awkward thing and you were like, I forgot to turn my ringer off, and you're frantically scrambling for your phone, and you answer it anyway because you realize it's someone that you know super well, and like, why would they be calling me during church? And you answer it, and you pick it up, and you say, what's going on? And they say, the one you love is sick and in the hospital, and they need you. You would know who they were talking about. Because the other people you love are probably sitting next to you. And so it would narrow it down instantly to a group of people. It's a small and intimate set of friends and family. You would know. And what would you do? You would go. You're like, well, my phone already rang in service, and they need me, so I'm going to go. And you would get up and you would walk out in the middle of the service because that would matter more than what you were doing right now. So everyone expects Jesus to do that. But instead, when he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. Remember that, because this is going to become important. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So before he does anything, he tells them why he's doing it. First, he says, this sickness will not end in death. And then second, he says, and by the way, what's about to happen is going to increase God's glory, and the Son of God will be glorified through what happens next. So before he does anything, he gives them his purpose statement. He gives them a purpose statement for what he's about to do, because he knows, and I know now looking back at the story, that it's going to be really confusing. That his actions and even his attitude is going to seem to be out of sync with his love for Lazarus. And he says, what's about to happen is going to increase God's glory in your presence. Why is that important? Why is it so important that God's glory would increase? And this is what I know to be true. When God's glory shines, it has the power to push back your darkness, to reignite your hope, and to change your perspective. That's why God's glory increasing in your life is so important, because it can push back the dark places in your life where you're confused and feel alone. It can reignite hope that has almost gone out or gone out completely, and it can change your whole perspective about your situation that you're struggling with in the first place. God's glory increasing in your life is important, and Jesus knows this, and he tells them in advance, this is why I'm about to do what I'm going to do. And then the text reminds us once again, John wants to make it really clear. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. 2 times, in just a few sentences, John made it clear that Jesus loved these people. The first came when he said that the message was simply the one you love is sick. And the second came when he reaffirms Jesus' love for Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Why? Why does anyone in your life tell you that they love you more than once in one short conversation? If you walked in the door from work and your spouse was like, honey, do you know how much I love you? And you're like, yeah, thanks, honey. And they're like, no, I really love you. You're like, hold on a second. Like, what's going to come next? Like, did you set something on fire or break something or spin or buy something you shouldn't have bought, right? Or if you have kids and your kids are like, Daddy, do you know how much I love you? And you're like, what do you want? You're like, show me your report card, right? Because the reason we reaffirm love over and over again isn't simply because we want the person to know that they're loved. It's because what's going to come next might cause us to doubt that love. John wants to make it clear that Jesus loved these people. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he, meaning Jesus, stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. What is happening? So they sent the message expecting him to come immediately. And all the disciples and all the people that knew how much Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha would also have expected him to leave immediately to attend to this friend of his that lay sick. And they probably had a little bit of comfort because Jesus had said, well, he's not going to die. So they probably had a little bit of peace, but they would have had this really weird mix of confusion over why would he wait and really actually being glad that he didn't go, because what you and I maybe don't understand is that Judea was not a safe place for them. Last time they had been there, in fact, the religious leaders had been so angry at Jesus because he was upsetting their apple cart that they'd tried to kill him by picking up stones and trying to stone him to death by throwing stones at him. So for the disciples, part of them was like, phew, like, I'm glad we're not going. The other part is like, wait, don't you love him? And so as we look at this, we can understand that even the disciples struggled in some of the similar ways that you and I would struggle. And if it was me, I'd be like, Jesus, listen, let's not go back to Judea. I know Lazarus is important to you, but since he's not going to die, and by the way, you might not know this, Jesus, but when they throw rocks at you, sometimes they miss you and hit me. Right? And that's not fun, so let's stay here. But it's gonna get even more confusing. So they're questioning him, and they're pushing back about this. So Jesus answered. You think he's about to set their minds at ease, but this is what he says. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? What? Like, we're just talking about stonings and Lazarus who's sick. Why are you talking about daylight? Duh, yeah, we know that there's 12 hours of daylight, but don't try to change the subject on us, Jesus. Like, we want to talk about the important thing, but it just keeps going. Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. So this side of this story, on the back end of the story, as we read it and I study it, I can look at that and be like, oh, I get it. Jesus is the light of the world, and they don't even know it yet. And all these people are walking in darkness, and they're stumbling around, they're tripping, and they're falling, and they're in danger. And Jesus' glory is going to increase here in a few moments, and they're going to actually see that he shines with the brightest light they've ever had, and he's going to ignite hope in them that has the power to push back darkness so they no longer stumble around in the night. So once again, he's reaffirming his purpose of why he's even on the planet, but they had no idea at that moment what he was talking about. This would have been a big moment for them. Like, Jesus, get to the point. But he wanted them to know that in a moment, in the next few days, that he was going to give them a light for their life that could weather any storm. That he was going to show them how much he cared. That he was going to prove to them how much power he had. He was going to show them that he's not uncooperative or inattentive or ever late. God is never late. He is always right on time. And when he shows up, light enters our life. So he gives them this little mini sermonette. And then it says this. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake. And they're like, now you're just messing with us. So is he sick or is he not? Is he asleep or is he not? And they're like, you're really confusing, Jesus. And so his disciples are like, Jesus, let me help you understand what happens here. If he sleeps, he will get better. That's the way it works. Didn't your mom ever tell you that? Honey, you're okay. Just go to bed. You'll feel better in the morning. So that's what the disciples, they do to Jesus here in this moment. They're like, listen, Jesus, this is the way it works. If he's simply asleep, he's going to get better in the morning. Here comes my nose again. So Jesus is getting a lesson on sleep from his disciples. But Jesus had been speaking of Lazarus' death. But his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he drops this bomb in their laps and he tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead. This would have shattered their hearts. And not only shattered their hearts, but messed up their heads because they'd been sitting there for 2 days, right? They would have known Lazarus. They would have cared about Lazarus. They would have loved Lazarus in a lot of ways, maybe just as much as Jesus did. And if you go back to the beginning of the story, when Jesus was like, this sickness will not end in death. Hold on. Jesus, 2 days ago, you told us that this sickness would not end in death, and now you're saying he's dead? Like, what's wrong with you? But then it gets even more rude and seemingly more insensitive when Jesus says, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there. But let us go to him now. So wait a second, Jesus, you knew this whole time that he was going to die? And it feels like maybe you lied to us because you said he wouldn't die? But now you're saying you want to go to him, but now it's already been 2 days, and it's going to take us 2 days to walk there, by the way, Jesus. And you knew that Mary and Martha were waiting for you? You knew, and you didn't do anything? Like, we don't understand. What could possibly be so important that you would let that happen? You would allow them to suffer in that way. What could possibly be so important, Jesus, that you wouldn't do something about that? And the answer is you. And the answer is me. And the answer is all of them that were about to witness what he was going to do. The answer is that we needed to know who Jesus was with no questions afterwards. We needed an opportunity to draw a line in the sand in our faith and say, we get it now. Like, you're not just a teacher. You're not just a rabbi that we follow and we commit our lives to your teachings, but we are actually God. We are what's so important in this moment, even when Jesus seems late. So he's like, let us now go to him. And Thomas, I've told you before that Thomas is the Eeyore of the Bible. He's like, let us now go with him so that we too may die. Doesn't that sound like Eeyore? I love it. Let us now go to him that we too may die. What a fatalist. And they do. They take off. A 2-day walk. So let's do the math. Ready? So it's a 2-day walk. He'd already hung out for 2 days. So that means by the time they rolled into Bethany, it would have been 4 days. And what the Bible tells us is that Lazarus had actually been dead for 4 days. So let's do the math again. That means that Lazarus probably died the day that Jesus got the message. He knew that. It didn't matter whether he had left right away because Lazarus was already dead. Jesus knew that. So why 4 days? Why is 4 days significant? In that culture, they had this really kind of interesting and weird belief that they had. You got to remember, this is before modern medicine. And they didn't understand a lot about sickness and death and dying. And they believed that the spirit, the soul of an individual would stay in the body for 3 days. That a person's soul would like hover around and in the body for 3 days. And on the 4th day, their soul would depart. So on day 4, maybe up until day 3, Mary and Martha might have still held out hope. Maybe up until day 3, they were probably like, no, you don't understand. Jesus will come. Jesus will be here. Like even now, Jesus, we believe. But now it's day 4. 4 days. His soul is departed. He gone. Like gone. I don't mean to be crass, but it's true. It's why it's significant. If I was a disciple, I would have been really embarrassed and really scared at the same time. Like looking for people with rocks and also embarrassed that now we're rolling into town on day 4. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's the first thing she says to him. Lord, if you had been here, she comes out of her house. She meets him on the road. If you had only been here, he wouldn't have died. How many times have we done this to God? Like, this is your fault. God, this is if you had only fill in the blank, then this would not have happened. This is your fault. And we point our finger at God and we shake our fist at the sky. And this is that moment for Martha. But even in that moment when she's saying, God, this is your fault, she's still holding on to this little kernel of hope because she believed in who he was. And she says that. She says, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again at the resurrection at the last day. Blah, 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 blah. This was something that people in that time said to people when they lost someone. Like and they felt it became like an empty platitude. You know what I'm talking about? When you struggled, you're wrestling through something really hard and really difficult in your life, and someone's like, they pat your back, and they're like, God has a plan. And you're like, that's not helpful. I'm sure there's a reason. Pat, pat, rub, rub, empty word after empty word. And you're like, but they're dead. And I'm hurting. And this is hard, and it doesn't make sense, and I don't understand what you're doing, Lord. Stop giving me empty platitudes. And so Martha comes, and she's like, if only you had been here, you wouldn't have died. And even now I know that you can do something. And then she probably felt like he gave her another empty platitude. Like, Jesus, you're just like everyone else. I know he'll rise again at the resurrection at the last day, but I would like him to be alive today. And she has no idea what Jesus is actually saying to her. Who Jesus is actually standing in front of her. And so he tells her. He says, I am the resurrection and life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. He says, Martha, you're concerned with death. I see that. I know that. I know this is hard for you. But the very essence of life is standing in front of you. I'm not talking about some resurrection that'll happen at the end of time. I'm not. That's true. But me right now in front of you, offering you something that you can have from no one else. Life and life to the full. I am the very essence of life. I am the resurrection. I'm life, and I'm the only way to get it. That's it. And he asks her in that moment the same question that he asks you and that he asks me every day. Do you believe this? Jesus said to her, do you believe this? This is a watershed moment for Martha. This is the hinge pin of the rest of her life right here in this moment. Jesus asking her the question, standing right in front of the other people that had come out and seen her come out, and standing right in front of the disciples. Right, even as Lazarus, her brother, lay dead in the tomb, Jesus is saying, do you believe that I am who I say I am? And she nails it. Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And she turns and she walks away to go get her sister. I really believe for Martha in this moment, this was it. Like she had decided, yeah, I do. I believe. And she decided to believe despite her lack of understanding. Even while her brothers still lay dead in the tomb, she said, I believe, and she turned. She walked into the rest of her life. Jesus was enough. Even in the midst of her pain, even in the midst of her struggle, enough. And she goes and gets Mary so that Mary can come back too and experience Jesus the way that she did. But Mary comes much more broken. Mary comes weeping. Mary brings all of her people with her who are also weeping. Mary, who had stayed back at the house, probably so angry and so frustrated and so hurt and so broken that she didn't even, the last thing she wanted to do was come and meet Jesus because Jesus was the source of her pain. But she comes out anyway. She falls down at his feet, weeping and saying, Jesus, if only you had come, he would not be dead. She's saying the same thing that Martha herself was saying. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. He sees her. He was deeply moved to the core of who he was, over her pain, over her trouble, over her heartache. Even knowing what he was about to do, his heart was still troubled and his spirit was torn. So what did Jesus do in that moment? He wept. Jesus wept. He wept over her pain. He wept over her loss. He wept over her disappointment. He wept over her confusion. He wept over the things in her life that didn't make sense whatsoever. He wept over the need for this entire experience so that God could be glorified and he could be lifted up, so that all people might have hope and all people might have life and experience that resurrection and that hope that's reignited and that darkness that gets pushed back. He wept over her still the same, knowing what was to come next. He still wept because he loved her and he felt for her and he stepped into her pain with her, because that's what Jesus does. That's who Jesus is. That even though he doesn't prevent the pain from your life, he experiences the pain in your life with you. And he sits there with you in the midst of it. Today, tomorrow, and the next day. Jesus wept. And then the Jews who were watching, they were kind of mixed about what they saw. Some said, "See how he loved him?" But some others said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So let me explain what was happening here. Some were like, "Oh, look at Jesus. Like, he must have really loved them. He's crying. Jesus is crying." Their hearts were like, "Oh, that is so awesome." And other people were like, "Really? Like, those, seriously, that can't be real. Because if he really actually loved him, he would have done something about it. We've heard that he could heal the blind and do all this miraculous stuff, but he let his friend die." So that even the crowd right in that moment was asking the question that all of us ask sometimes: why didn't God do something about that? If he actually loved him, why didn't he do something about that? They were asking the normal and natural question that came from the normal and natural struggles of their life. Why did he do something about that? And so he follows them to the tomb, and he commands that it be open. And they're like, "Jesus, no, 4 days." It's like stabbing him again. 4 days, Jesus, he's been dead. And in the King James, I love this, it actually says, "Lord, he stinketh." Not good. Super insensitive. Hashtag not something you should say at a funeral, okay? Write it down. Not okay at all. But that's what they say to Jesus. And he's like, "No, roll it back. Roll back the stone." And then he reminds them of his purpose statement. He says, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Did I not tell you that when the glory of God increases, it pushes back darkness and increases the light so that you won't stumble around in ignorance, lifeless and hopeless?" So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." So Jesus, in this moment, he prays out loud to God the Father. And in that prayer acknowledges, "Okay, Father, here we go. This is going to be sweet. And I know that you know that I know that we don't need to do this right now. But I'm doing it because I want to make it clear to everyone here that I'm not just some parlor trick magician doing some fancy sleight of hand moment with Lazarus. But I want everyone here to know that what's about to happen is because you are who we say you are, and I am who we say I am. That I am the resurrection and life. Because Jesus was late so that they would know and that they would believe that he was the Son of God. This is that moment. This is that opportunity for all of them that we all, not just that they would know, but that everyone would know. That we would know today, sitting in this place. And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." And the text tells us that they left, many of them believing. You don't think, right? Like, would you have believed in that moment? Absolutely. We all would have. God's glory was shining as bright as the noonday sun in that moment, and everything began to make sense. God is never late. And you have to know that Jesus' failure to show up when they called for him had to have been one of their greatest disappointments. One of their greatest disappointments in their entire life. It was personal. It was public. They told everyone probably Jesus will come. It'll be okay. And then it appeared that it wasn't, and now it was. And what they didn't realize is that the scene of our greatest disappointments can become the scenes for some of our greatest miracles. As God doesn't necessarily always resurrect our Lazarus, but he always resurrects our hope and always resurrects our dreams and always replaces what was missing that we didn't even know that we needed. Because God is never, ever late. And God can always be found in the waiting, weeping with us, loving us, seeing us in that place. And this is what I know to be true, that when God seems late, despite your lack of understanding, despite your confusion about what was happening in this moment, that I know that God can still be trusted while you wait. That God's plan is still on point while you wait. That God's goodness is still alive and real while you wait. That God can still be trusted while you wait. Because God sees you, God knows you, God loves you, and God is always working on a bigger story. Always working on a bigger story. The question is, will we find him in the waiting? I'm going to invite the band to come out. And I'm going to have them play you a song in a moment. And I'm convinced that if Mary and Martha, imagine they're walking back to their house, the same house where Mary had poured perfume all over his feet and worshiped him, the same house where they'd had these beautiful and life-changing discussions, the same house where Lazarus had died. They're walking back, and if they had gone back to their home and said to themselves, we got to write this down. Like the things we learned today, the things we learned about who Jesus is, about the power of God, the things we learned about finding our true life in the waiting, we got to write this down, and we're going to make a song, and we want to sing it, and we're going to sing it for the next 2,000 years until people believe it. I believe that it could have been the song we're about to hear. The words that they would have written would have been something similar to what the band is about to sing to you and over you. And my hope, my heart for you today is that for those of you who are sitting here today in the waiting, that these words would be an encouragement to you and that you would find him in the waiting. Listen to the song. So good, huh? So as I hear those words, and I imagine God, the one who holds the very stars in his hands, the one who knows them by name and knows you by name. I imagine him holding us. I imagine his power and his authority and his love and his grace, his attentiveness. I imagine a God who is never late but is always right on time. And I believe. I trust. And I let go of all of my confusion and all of my disbelief and all of my questions. And I bust past that place where my understanding or my lack of understanding is the barrier between myself and salvation. And we answer the question that Jesus asked Martha thousands of years ago. When he looked at her and he said, I am the resurrection and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. He looks at us and he asks us that same question, and we simply say, I believe. I believe. And we find him in the waiting. I'm ready. I'm there. I've done it. I've answered it, and I've turned, and I've walked away in the rest of my life knowing that he walks with me. And I am convinced that some of you are ready to do the same. So what I want to do is I want to invite you to stand, all of you, just to stand right here in this place. And my hope is that for some of you, just like the song said, that we have an opportunity to rise in victory, that this would be the day that you've risen in victory. And I want to pray with you and for you. And my hope is that you would find him in the waiting today. Would you pray with me? So God our Father, we love you, we trust you, but we don't always understand you, and that's okay. So in this moment, in the quiet of our own hearts, in a personal and profound way, we just give over our confusion to you. Our hurt, our frustration, our pain. And for many of us, God, we're sitting here, and our Lazarus never rose. But you did. And when you did, God, you brought victory for all of us. And so we claim that victory today, committing our life to you, our doubts, our fears, our struggle to you, praying that you would pierce our darkness. You'd bring light to the most difficult places of our journey, and that you would reignite our hope, and you would change our perspective, and that we would come to a place, God, today we choose to believe that you are never late, that you know us, that you love us, that you weep over us, that you laugh with us, you celebrate with us. And we commit our lives to you, to that God, the one who is found in the waiting. So Jesus, we love you, we trust you, and we pray all these things in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord.